I'm Nastasia Tain. This is the NewsHour live from our headquarters in Doha. Coming up in the next 60 minutes. Tunisia's first freely elected president dies at the age of 92. We look at the legacy of Beji Caid Essebsi. Just to start, protesters welcome the resignation of Puerto Rico's governor, but more work needs to be done. And the new British Prime Minister Boris Johnson makes his first speech in Parliament, pledging to deliver on Brexit and reinvigorate the nation.
And in sport, Manchester United record a fourth straight pre-season win. United beating Champions League runners-up Tottenham 2-1 in Shanghai.
Now, Tunisia's 92-year-old president, Beji Caid Essebsi, has died. He played a major role in the country's transition to democracy after a revolution in 2011, which saw the overthrow of longtime leader Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Imran Khan reports.
Beji Caid Essebsi came to power in December 2014 after winning the first free presidential election. His career began 40 years earlier and took him through various posts in defence, security and foreign affairs. He briefly served as interim prime minister in 2011. Tunisia was the first to experience a wave of protests that became known as the Arab Spring in 2010. The following year, they led to the ousting of longtime president Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. And in the first free elections 3 years later, Essebsi, at the head of a newly created party, won a runoff that polarised voters. He was often accused of giving in to many of the demands of the Islamist opposition, led by the Ennahda party. His opponents also accused him of trying to instill a return to Ben Ali-style strongman politics. In April, Essebsi announced that he did not want to run in elections scheduled for later this year, despite strong support for another presidential term from within his own Nida Tunis party. The North African state has been hailed as the Arab Spring's only democratic success, because the protests that toppled Ben Ali didn't trigger the violent upheaval seen in Egypt and Libya. But since 2011, successive governments have failed to resolve Tunisia's economic problems, which include high inflation and unemployment. Essebsi was taken to a military hospital in the capital, Tunis. His second hospital visit in less than a week.
Now, the interim president has been announced and he'll be sworn in later on Thursday. He's the Speaker of Parliament, Mohamed Ennassir.
In the name of God Almighty, we announce the demise of President Essebsi, the President of the Republic. I offer the heartfelt condolences to his family and to the Tunisian people. I see this opportunity to commend the efforts of the late President as he has contributed to the state following independence and throughout his tenure over the last 5 years. I also stress that the state affairs will run as normal and the Speaker of the House will stand as acting President. I seize the opportunity to address the Tunisian people to stand united in harmony and to continue to march forward towards further development and well-being.
So what's next for Tunisia? Well, under the country's constitution, Mohamed Ennassir will assume the presidency for 45 to 90 days while elections are organised. Tunisia's parliamentary elections are slated for October 6th. Now, 3 parties rule the North African country together, but their coalition has been hit by infighting, and this has hampered decision-making and slowed economic reforms demanded by foreign donors. Well, for more on this, we can speak to William Lawrence, who's a professor of international affairs at George Washington University, and he joins us now from Washington, D.C. William, let's start by talking about Essebsi's legacy. He was such a fixture in Tunisian politics. How's he likely to be remembered?
He will be remembered as one of the giants of modern Tunisian history. Bourguiba, the founder of the state, was his idol. He was one of his right-hand men. He served as the Director of National Security, Minister of Interior, Minister of Defense, and also ambassador to Germany, to France, under Bourguiba, and then under his successor, Ben Ali. And he was very much part of the socialist Destourian tradition, Destourian meaning constitutional tradition in Tunisian politics. And in many ways, Tunisia's success following the Arab Spring was that it had a great constitution and a great constitutional tradition, particularly with regards to women's rights. And the president was very much a champion of women's rights and constitutionalism, and will be remembered as one of the architects of the modern Tunisian state.
Indeed, and he has been ill for some time, though. He was 92, so I guess the country knew this was coming. Does that mean we'll see a smooth transition, especially given, I believe, there's no constitutional court to rule on what's actually supposed to happen next?
Yeah, I think Tunisians are very institutionally strong, and they will find a constitutional way to weather this crisis, unlike what we see, for example, in Algeria or Sudan. But there's a real problem here because since 2014, the country was effectively ruled by what they call the two sheiks, the head of the Nehda party, Ghannouchi, who's recently declared he's running for parliament, and who is the head of the Nehda party, the Islamist moderate party, and Beji Qaid Sebsi, who is head of the NIDA party, which has been increasingly fragmenting in recent years. And the Carthage-packed coalition fell apart earlier this year, and we were entering a problematic period in Tunisian politics. And at stake is the democratic transition itself if a certain number of parties don't coalesce around a democratic agenda. And there are populists in the wings who would love to grab power if they could. There's been fighting over who can run for president recently, and the leading candidate was disqualified because of corruption. And so there are the threats you mentioned and other threats to Tunisian democracy, and Tunisia will need a steady hand, and that steady hand has not yet emerged.
Indeed, something we'll be keeping a close eye on. William Lawrence there from George Washington University. Thank you for your analysis on Al Jazeera.
My pleasure.
Well, Puerto Rico's governor has announced his resignation after nearly 2 weeks of mass protests. The crowds came out after the release of offensive messages sent between Ricardo Rossello and his top advisors. But there was already anger over corruption in a U.S. territory that's bankrupt. Gabriel Elizondo reports from the capital, San Juan.
A victory for the people. And this was the moment they found out. After 2 weeks of street protests, it was near midnight, Puerto Rico's governor, Ricardo Rossello, said he would finally step down.
Despite having a mandate from the people who elected me democratically, today I feel that continuing in this position presents insurmountable difficulties. Having heard the complaints, spoken to my family, thought of my children, and in prayers, I've taken the following decision. I announce to you today that I'll be resigning as governor, effective Friday, 2nd of August.
Those on the streets were elated.
We are right outside the governor's mansion, and this is the scene right now. As soon as the governor announced that he was going to step down, this is a movement that has been led mostly by young people, under 30 years old. And you can get a sense of the excitement. What are you feeling right now?
I'm feeling happiness. This is such, but we can't stop here. He's just won. We gotta keep protesting, man.
They're calling it a revolution. Others, like Heidi, say it's Puerto Rico's Arab Spring.
I was euphoric. I couldn't believe it. The first generation. Do you know how proud we feel? You know, the first generation to get a governor out of the island just because we said so. We went to the streets and we took power of it.
A change of power that began with 2 cabinet members being arrested by the FBI for alleged corruption. One was the Minister of Education, and was followed by the leaking of private text messages sent by the governor. In them, he insulted his own people, made vulgar comments about women, and appeared to joke about the Puerto Ricans killed in Hurricane Maria 2 years ago. But this was a transition also about a people who rose up and demanded more from their leaders on an island that's a U.S. territory.
This was a resistance movement, I would say. Finally, you know, all the power, energy, frustration came out. We had everybody with us. This is what it was. And it's here to stay. We are demanding big changes from our government, not just his resignation. This is going for long. It's an overhaul of government and our institutions.
2 weeks of taking to the streets, and these people say they've reclaimed their government, and now they can celebrate. Gabriel Elizondo, Al Jazeera, San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Well, it's now just past 11 a.m. in San Juan, and you're now watching live pictures of more crowds gathering in Puerto Rico's capital. Well, our correspondent, Andy Gallagher, is there, and he joins us now live. Andy, I believe you're standing where we saw those amazing pictures of those celebrations last night. How significant have these last few days been?
Well, it's hard to understate what just happened here over the past 2 weeks in Puerto Rico. I've been reporting from this island for 15 years and never seen anything the likes of this. The newspaper headlines really say it all, historic resignation, and really that is what the people here wanted. Remember, this is still an island recovering from Hurricane Maria, which happened 2 years ago, and lots of people here were just simply fed up with the allegations of corruption, with the slow movement of the government, and ultimately this 900-page document in which Ricardo Rosselló, the governor, and his former other cabinet mates were talking about the people of this island with utter disrespect, as well as those sexist and homophobic comments that were made. So people here had simply had enough, and after 2 weeks of unprecedented demonstrations on the street. The governor's building here now behind me, Ricardo Rosselló, will leave his office on August the 2nd, but this island has many challenges which now lay ahead.
Indeed, and we've been hearing from some of the protesters that all of this, well, this victory, his resignation isn't enough for them, and they're clearly out again. How long do you think this is likely to continue?
Well, there are celebrations today, but these are more of a party celebration. We've seen plenty of people turning up here to take selfies and wave Puerto Rican flags. But there is a harsh reality that this island now has to wake up to. Remember, Puerto Rico has about $74 billion of debt. The power company here alone is $9 billion in debt. The infrastructure has been slowly corroding over the years. And of course, it's still an island recovering from Hurricane Maria almost 2 years ago. So we are now essentially without a government. And the problem with that is that so many people have resigned. It was supposed to be the Secretary of State that would take the governor's place. Now it's the Secretary of Justice, someone who's had her own problems. So whilst people here are celebrating what was a monumental victory, the reality is this island needs good leadership. It needs to tackle huge economic and other problems on the island, as well as recovering from that hurricane. So while the celebrations are continuing today, this is an island that is still very much in crisis. It still very much needs good, solid leadership, and one that needs to win faith in its own people.
Our correspondent Andy Gallagher keeping an eye on developments for us in San Juan. Thank you, Andy. Well, plenty more ahead on this NewsHour, including North Korea fires missiles into the sea just weeks after agreeing to restart nuclear talks with the United States. And a very French drenching, how people are cooling off with parts of Europe in the clutches of yet another heatwave. And in sport, the young boxer who's following in his famous father's footsteps, Andy will be here with that story. Now, in his first speech to MPs as Britain's new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has asked the European Union to think again about its refusal to renegotiate a Brexit deal. Johnson also said his government would prioritise preparations for exiting without an agreement if there is no deal by the October 31st deadline. Charlie Angela reports from London.
Inside 10 Downing Street, a rousing welcome from a loyal team. Prime Minister Boris Johnson's new cabinet, dominated by Brexit hardliners, had their first pep talk.
And as you all know, we have a momentous task ahead of us, at a pivotal moment in our country's history. We are now committed, all of us, to leaving the European Union on October the 31st, or indeed earlier. No ifs, no buts.
There's far too much noise in this chamber.
But in Parliament, a very different mood. Johnson had promised to unite the Conservative Party, but his ruthless decision to sack or sideline 17 senior ministers may have done the opposite. His enemies on the backbenches are many. But his first statement was one of optimism, channeling his hero Winston Churchill, painting a picture of a golden future for Britain.
That is why I believe that if we bend our sinews to the task now, there is every chance that in 2050, into when I fully intend to be around, though not necessarily in this job, we will be able to look back on this period, this extraordinary period, as the beginning of a new golden age for our United Kingdom.
But the opposition leader dismantled that idea.
No one underestimates this country, but the country is... But the country is deeply worried that the new Prime Minister overestimates himself.
This is the last day Parliament will sit before breaking for the summer. But the challenges facing the new Prime Minister are immense. Negotiate a new Brexit deal in 98 days, a deal the EU says cannot be renegotiated, and fix a multitude of problems facing Britain in healthcare, education and security, all with just a parliamentary majority of just 3. Many say the country could be heading for a general election.
You know, he did say during the leadership campaign that he doesn't want to have a general election before he's delivered Brexit. But that doesn't seem to be as much of a hard red line as I will do Brexit before the 31st of October. So that might suggest that he will try and call a snap election, relatively soon.
This is a Prime Minister with a deadline like no other, facing unprecedented opposition, hoping his optimism is infectious. Charlie Angela, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, our correspondent Andrew Simmons is outside Parliament in Westminster for us. Andrew, quite the performance from Boris in the House. What kinds of reactions are we seeing?
Well, a lot of reaction, but first of all, let's just take you through a bit of detail there. 129 questions put to Boris Johnson. It lasted 2 hours. He was like a bull charging, making promises right, left and centre, answering questions sometimes briefly, sometimes stridently, sometimes almost angrily, rounding on various politicians. But as you heard there, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, was suggesting that he overestimated his own capabilities. He's certainly made a lot of promises. He's seen by many politicians now as to have really sold down the line of becoming a campaign government rather than an inclusive government, a campaign cabinet with one direction, and that is to get the country out of the European Union. We understand that Johnson will be speaking on the phone to Jean-Claude Juncker of the EU Commission in the coming hour. What is going to be discussed there is unknown. Wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall of that one? He is insistent that the Northern Irish backstop is dead. He's not interested in that insurance policy which would preserve the trade for the Irish Republic, which would solve a massive problem for the Irish Republic if that could happen, which is a member of the European Union. The Irish Republic still desperately worried about this situation. And so we have a position now whereby the government, the actual parliament, is now in summer recess. There was a suggestion from the smaller opposition party, the Liberal Democrats, that there should be a vote of confidence in Johnson. Labour was not interested in that. Well, certainly not now, but you can most certainly expect them to be pushing towards it given the opportunity. They're keeping their powder dry. It's quite possible, according to one person who's was quite close to Boris Johnson, a former Tory MP, there could be an election sooner rather than later.
I think that Boris Johnson, if he sees that he's going to lose a vote of, say, no confidence in the House of Commons, I think he would rather call the election than wait for his government to fall and the election to follow. He would rather stay on the front foot. So I think the whole of Britain ought to be on the alert for an early snap general election called perhaps right at the beginning of September. That might happen.
Well, Andrew, as you say, we keep hearing all this optimism and all these promises from Johnson, but given all the challenges he also faces, what's the likelihood of an early election? We're hearing all this speculation already.
Well, Nastasia, there is a high expectation that it could go that way. No one really wants it, least of all the Conservative Party, but let's face it, will have a majority of 2 by the end of summer. By-election is not going to go their way, most certainly, and there could be some defections from the Conservative Party. That can't be ruled out. Just a quick word on Theresa May. She was watching the cricket at Lord's this afternoon instead of being there. A lot of her former cabinet members were there as well. That's her level of interest in what's going on here. We have a real partisan type of situation in government now where the Brexiteers are in a hard charge position, and so therefore the answer to your question is it's very possible there could be an election, and that is something Boris Johnson is preparing for. You could tell from his body language, charging at the Labour opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn sitting there, just his mouth was dry, it would seem. There was a very sort of strange mood in the opposition front bench. But yes, it's very likely there'll be an election, and anybody would guess which way that could go, and that is a real possibility.
Andrew Simmons keeping an eye on all that drama for us in Westminster. Thank you, Andrew. Well, Johnson's promise to renegotiate a new deal with the EU without the so-called backstop to keep the Irish border open has already been rejected by Ireland's leader. Leo Varadkar told Irish television that Brussels won't change the agreement already made with the UK.
Listening to what he said today, I got the impression that he wasn't just talking about deleting the backstop. He was talking about a whole new deal, a better deal for Britain. That's not going to happen. The European Council doesn't meet until the 12th of October. We've no plans to meet any earlier than that. And even if we were to change the negotiating guidelines, we wouldn't be changing to them.
On to other news now, and North Korea has conducted its first missile test just weeks after expressing more anger at planned military drills between South Korea and the United States. Now, South Korea and Japan say 2 short-range missiles were fired into the sea off the coast at Wonsan. South Korea's defense ministry is urging Pyongyang to stop its tests.
South Korean government has been closely monitoring the related moves of North Korea, and we urged North Korea to stop such actions that don't help the efforts to relieve tensions on the Korean peninsula. South Korean government will step up its monitoring posture under US-South Korea cooperation and closely communicate in regard with this.
You'll remember that last month, US President Trump held talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un during a surprise visit when he became the first sitting American president to step foot into North Korea. Robert Bride has more from Seoul.
Officials in South Korea and also Japan are analysing data from this double missile launch, working with their US allies, looking in particular at one of these missiles that travelled a total of 690 kilometres, which they believe could be a new type of weapon, with reports that possibly this missile has a guided capability, enabling it to avoid interception. Now, if this is true, then it means that North Korea, while they have certainly stopped nuclear testing and the launch of bigger intercontinental ballistic missiles, are still developing their weapons systems. It's a message that has been driven home with the release of photographs earlier this week of Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, visiting a submarine in a shipyard. Now, it's not known whether this is a new submarine under construction, as the North Koreans claim, or simply an older type of sub that is being refitted, but the consensus among analysts is that it is a submarine that is large enough to carry submarine-launched ballistic missiles, a technology that North Koreans have been trying to develop over the last couple of years.
I think people in South Korea, Japan, and the United States need to be more concerned about that inspection by Kim Jong-un of the new type of submarine than the test firing of short-range projectiles. Because if North Korea acquires nuclear submarines that can launch nuclear ballistic missiles, then it would be a game changer.
Thursday's missile launch seems to be an expression of North Korean anger at upcoming exercises between South Korean and US forces in August, and also showing its frustration that once again talks seem to have stalled, even after the heightened hopes of the surprise meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un at the DMZ barely a few weeks ago. It is the fear of talks collapsing that has led to a guarded response from South Korea, saying that the launch of the missiles was a threat but not necessarily a provocation. Japan had a firmer response, saying that if this does turn out to be ballistic missiles, even though they were short range, this does violate UN resolutions and could and should possibly have consequences.
Now, members of Sudan's opposition have called for marches across the capital, Khartoum. It comes a week after a power-sharing deal was signed by members of the ruling military council and the civilian coalition. On Wednesday, the junta said it had foiled a coup attempt. The military's chief of staff was among a number of high-ranking officials detained. Senior Somali officials have been buried after a suicide bombing in the capital. Al-Shabaab claimed the attack in Mogadishu, saying it was an assassination attempt on the UN Special Envoy, American diplomat James Swan. The bombing killed 9 officials from the local government headquarters. Mogadishu Mayor Abdirahman Omar was injured and remains in a critical condition.
We are here to bury 3 of our beloved district commissioners. We send our condolences to all people of Somalia. These terrorists are not just targeting government officials, but democracy and the freedom of this country. We need the people to collaborate with the government to eliminate these terrorists.
There have been 3 explosions in the Afghan capital, Kabul. At least 10 people have been killed and more than 40 others injured. ISIL has claimed responsibility for 2 explosions, one targeting a bus and then the ambulances that followed. The 3rd blast has been claimed by the Taliban. Now, a heat wave has sent temperatures soaring across Europe, breaking records in France, Britain, Belgium and the Netherlands. It's even forced the shutdown of a nuclear reactor in Germany as the water got too hot. Well, the Eiffel Tower's fountains have become a refuge for Parisians, with the city recording its highest temperature on Thursday, 42.4 degrees Celsius. France has issued its top heat wave alert level, warning the public of potentially deadly temperatures. And across the Channel, Britain's experiencing its hottest July, with temperatures still rising. They're heading for a record, creeping towards 39 degrees. While Belgium's already broken its highest mark, topping 40 degrees on Thursday, the hottest in almost 200 years of keeping records. Scientists say the never-before-seen temperatures may now be the new normal.
During summer we have usually some heat waves, but the exceptional fact of this year is that the temperatures have risen very high for Belgium, and that we see during these last years that the heat waves are more and more frequent.
Well, still ahead on Al Jazeera. A tourist attraction, how Indonesia's most active volcano is luring more and more thrill seekers into the danger zone. And in sport, the new NBA duo that's hoping to make history at the LA Clippers.
Hello there. A fairly quiet picture across much of the Middle East. You can see on the satellite, no real cloud to talk of, certainly no rain either, but we have got 1 or 2 showers, very stray showers, still working their way across those central regions across into Georgia, and that could produce a few showers certainly on Friday. What we will notice as we go Friday into Saturday is lying through Pakistan, we will see some of those monsoonal rains, so we could see some scattered showers, some thunderstorms, and it could be heavy, of course, at times as well. 33 degrees is the high in Karachi on Saturday, 34 across into Kabul, and a nice day in Beirut with a high of 30 degrees Celsius. And then we head across into the Arabian Peninsula. There are some showers in the forecast, pushing into the southwest of Yemen Friday, but also on into Saturday. Temperatures are high and also feeling very humid in some of these cities. 41 in Doha with very high humidity, so really very humid indeed. 44 degrees on Saturday. There are those showers still into the southwest of Yemen. Meanwhile, we've got 34 Celsius and feeling nicer in Muscat. Then we head down into southern Africa. We need some rain here. There's no real rain in the forecast. You can see the cloud in the last few hours, but really any weather is well offshore. We might just see a bit of cloud around coastal areas near to Durban, 21 on Friday, and a similar temperature of 24 on Saturday.
Hello again, I'm Nastasia Tay in Doha. A reminder of our top stories this hour. Tunisia's president, Beji Caid Essebsi, has died at the age of 92. He played a major role in the country's transition to democracy after a revolution in 2011, which saw the overthrow of longtime leader Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. The head of parliament will be sworn in as interim president later on Thursday. Puerto Rico's governor has announced his resignation after nearly 2 weeks of mass protests. It was sparked by the release of offensive messages sent between Ricardo Rossello and his top advisors. But there was already anger over corruption in a US territory that's bankrupt. And in his first speech to Parliament as Britain's new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson urged the European Union to rethink its refusal to renegotiate a Brexit deal. He says his government will prioritise leaving without an agreement if there's no deal with the EU by the October 31st deadline. Well, world leaders will be eager to see what the UK's foreign policy will look like under a Boris Johnson-led government. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, reports from the United Nations on the potential changes and challenges ahead.
Geographically, the UK may be a small island in Northern Europe, but it retains a seat at the world's top table because of its economy and its history. Boris Johnson is now taking over leadership of a country with that permanent seat on the UN Security Council, as well as membership of the G7, of NATO, and for now of the European Union. PM Boris Johnson couldn't have a more different style from his predecessor Theresa May.
You think they've won?
He's loud and unpredictable. There'll certainly be a change of tone, but could there be a change of policy too? The first test will be Iran. The US has been trying to apply maximum pressure on Tehran. Could the UK, with one of its tankers seized by Iran, more fully join in that effort now?
You may see a bit of a transition here now, as you have oil tankers being seized, as you have drones being shot down. That all may change quite a bit here in the coming months. I do find it was interesting that the Iranians reached out very early and made a public statement congratulating Boris Johnson on his election. So certainly there was an effort there to try to draw him away from the U.S. and others.
Europe and the US don't share the same approach to Iran. President Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, while European nations with China and Russia are trying to keep it alive. If the UK changes its position, the deal will almost certainly die. On other issues, for example, Venezuela and the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, Europe and the US have very different perspectives. Could the new UK Prime Minister, who has warm relations with President Trump and who's keen to sign a post-Brexit trade deal with the US, realign his country? There are real concerns in Brussels and here at the UN about all of this, and about the fact there's now another leader on the world stage known for his unpredictability. James Bays, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
Now, Libya's navy is saying that at least 115 people are missing in a shipwreck off its coast. Around 140 were rescued and are being returned to Libya. Libya is a hub for migrants, many of whom try to reach Europe in risky boats. UN agencies have repeatedly called for survivors not to be returned to Libya because of conflicts in the country. Well, Charlie Yaxley from the United Nations Refugee Agency has reacted to this sinking, saying that today we have seen yet another tragedy on the Mediterranean. According to testimony from survivors, it's estimated that some 150 people have died at sea, which would make this the largest shipwreck on the Mediterranean in 2019. This horrific event highlights once again the dire need for a shift in approach to the Mediterranean situation. Urgent action is needed to save lives at sea and prevent people from getting on these boats in the first place by offering safe legal alternatives. Well, we can speak to Leonard Doyle, who is the spokesman for the International Organization for Migration. He joins us now via Skype from Sheffield in England. Leonard, 150 people potentially dead in this shipwreck, and this is just the largest this year. Talk us through the numbers more broadly and the trends that we're seeing.
Well, this is really a very dramatic event, as you just rightly said. There have been about 4,000 people who've taken to sea this year and have been intercepted, arrested and brought back, sadly typically put into detention, which we abhor. So it's a zero-sum game for the migrants. They think they're going to try and get a better life. They end up in the hands of smugglers, usually quite often abused, and then if they do make it onto the high seas, picked up, brought back, and in this case not picked up but drowned. So about 300 people left St. Cloms in a wooden boat, we understand. They were then put into rubber dinghies on the high seas, out of which one boat seems to have returned. There's about 150 people back on land, and the survivors, such as they are, manage to swim ashore, but the numbers are particularly high and dramatic.
And as you say, many of these migrants are then being returned to Libya. What kind of support are they receiving there?
Well, it's very controversial because typically they get some support from my colleagues in Iowa. We'll try and give them medical aid, or they'll try and give them some other support. But then they're typically taken back into detention, which is something that we advocate absolutely against. Or if they are to be in any way held, it should be in open centres. But the notion that they're locked away, having really committed no crime whatsoever except try to improve their lives, it's really appalling. And they're at the hands of, quite often at the hands of quite criminal people. You can see that in this case, traffickers, smugglers obviously tried to get them to Europe to make money out of them, simple as that, and on very unsafe boats. So it's really a misery. It's a tale of misery for these migrants.
Well, Leonard, as you say, clearly the danger of the crossing isn't acting as a deterrent. And now we're hearing from the UNHCR saying that urgent action is needed to provide safe legal alternatives. What kind of safe legal alternatives are we talking about here?
Well, quite rightly, both UNHCR and IOM earlier this week issued a joint statement calling really for better avenues, legal avenues for people those who are qualified to get to places, and those who need protection, those who have a good possibility of being judged to be refugees, for those also to be protected. So we need clearly to have some stability in Libya. The big problem is that there's a conflict going on, and the migrants then become a pawn in this game. They're used to make money for people. They have to pay their passage, quite often by being in indentured servitude in effect. And then they're put in the high seas. It's just not a happy situation. And Europeans turning away from it or banning boats from rescuing people is certainly not the way to go.
Indeed. Leonard Doyle there from the International Organization for Migration. Thank you for speaking to us on Al Jazeera, Leonard. Well, naval chiefs across West Africa are calling for more funding to fight rising cases of piracy in that region. They've been meeting in Ghana's capital, Accra, for a maritime defense conference. Delegates are looking for solutions to fight piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. They're also debating issues such as human and drug trafficking, as well as illegal fishing. Representatives of 10 West African states are taking part, and US, Chinese, French and Portuguese delegates are also present. The seas around West Africa remain the world's most dangerous for piracy. Over 90% of kidnappings took place between January and June in the Gulf of Guinea. Well, the US Navy is joining efforts to tackle piracy in that region, and our correspondent Nicholas Hack is on board the American ship that's visiting the Gulf of Guinea.
We're boarding the U.S. Navy ship, the Carson City, here harbored in Ghana, Accra. It's on a tour of duty in the Gulf of Guinea. After Dakar, Abidjan, it's now headed to the coast of Nigeria. The most dangerous waters on the world. There are more pirate attacks there than anywhere else. And so Commander Tyrone Bruce is getting its crew ready.
With our radar system and our lookouts, we have potential to see any threats that are approaching us, and miles out. So before any piracy issue would take place, we will have notification well in advance. So we should not ever be in that position.
On board is a mix of civilian and military crews. You have doctors, medics, but also engineers to help the navies in the region to maintain their aging fleet so that they can tackle piracy. While the White House may have announced in the past that it's planning to reduce troop levels in Africa, this year the Navy organized its biggest naval exercise, Operation Obangami. It seems the U.S. is keeping a close watch over African waters. For Ghana's defense minister, it's a matter of national interest.
Yes, and our trade routes are mostly through the sea, and close to 80% of our goods come from the sea. A lot of our, about 40 to 50% of our revenues, taxes come from the sea. And apart from that, it's an international trade route. And so we are obliged to make sure that it's safe. Because at the end of the day, we will have to play our part along the Gulf of Guinea to ensure that it is safe.
At stake is this, because 80% of the world's trade happens on water. Piracy is on the rise, not just here in the Gulf of Guinea, but throughout the world. And so navies across the world are trying to equip themselves to make these waters safer.
Ukraine has released the crew of a Russian tanker that it detained earlier on Thursday. Ukrainian authorities had seized the ship in the Black Sea, accusing it of being behind a ship blockading incident last year. Ukraine's security service released this video showing officers boarding the Russian boat. It was docked at a Ukrainian port. Kiev says the tanker was involved in an operation in November when its ships came under fire from Russian boats. Onto another tanker now, and India says all 24 crew members on board the Iranian tanker seized by the UK 3 weeks ago are safe. Its foreign ministry sent 3 people to visit the crew on the Iranian vessel off the coast of Gibraltar. India's government says it will do whatever it takes to ensure their release. British forces says the Grace 1 was delivering oil to Syria in breach of EU sanctions. Iran denies the allegation.
We had sought consular access. It was granted yesterday, and a 3-member team, they visited and met all the 24 crew members. What we saw was the crew members were very calm, very composed. There was no sense of panic. They were doing fine. They have been in regular touch with the family members. We assured them that the government of India would undertake all necessary steps to ensure their early release and repatriation.
Nissan will sack 12,500 workers by 2023. The arrest of its former chairman, Carlos Ghosn, in November has seen the automotive giant struggle to revive growth. Management now says it's cutting costs. In June, US vehicle maker Ford announced its plans to axe 12,000 jobs across Europe. And Boeing has announced its largest quarterly loss on record following the grounding of its 737 MAX aircraft. The company lost $3 billion in its second quarter and sales fell by more than a third. The 737 MAX fleet was grounded in March after 2 crashes in 5 months killed 346 people. A problem with software caused the planes to nosedive. Former US Special Counsel Robert Mueller has insisted once again that he did not exonerate President Trump on obstruction of justice. Mueller was testifying at 2 different hearings in Congress about his investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. It's the first time he's answered questions publicly since his report, which sharply divides Democrats and Republicans. Mike Hanna reports.
It was in President Trump's eyes a victory lap, appearing on the White House lawn to repeat his assertion that he'd been vindicated in dismissing the investigation, one that he claimed had placed a phony cloud over his presidency.
I think everybody understands that. I think everybody understands what's going on. There was no defense to this ridiculous hoax, this witch hunt that's been going on for a long time.
Earlier, the special counsel was careful to show no bias to one side or the other, disappointing those who wanted him to enlarge on his findings that there were 10 different acts that could be seen as the president obstructing justice. What they largely got was this.
I refer to the report on that. I'm not going to speak to that.
Along with the response that's trending on Twitter as a new way of saying politely, go away.
I take your question.
But he did confirm the president has not been telling the truth about the investigation.
So the report did not conclude that he did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the president?
No.
Now, in fact, your report expressly states that it does not exonerate the president.
It does.
Republicans fiercely defended the president.
He said Donald Trump is not above the law. He's not. But he damn sure shouldn't be below the law, which is where Volume 2 of this report puts him.
The former special counsel did seem to indicate the president could still face trouble from his report.
Could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the president of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes.
In an evening news conference, House Democrats continued to reject the view of the president and his Republican supporters and were insistent that Mueller's questioning was a crucial part of a congressional investigative process that could end in impeachment.
Why I'd like it to be a strong case is because it's based on the facts and the law. That's what matters. Not politics, not partisanship, just patriotism.
After a day that highlighted the political division in Congress, one thing is clear. The investigation into President Trump will not end with Robert Mueller. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Now, about 1.6 million people are facing food insecurity in Mozambique after two cyclones struck earlier this year. Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth hit just 6 weeks apart, flattening cities and villages and killing hundreds of people. Cyclone Idai also caused widespread flooding, washing away crops just weeks before harvest. Thousands of children are malnourished, and experts warn that the situation is expected to worsen from October. People living on the slopes of the most active volcano in Indonesia are used to danger. Now they're turning it into a tourist attraction for thrill seekers, as Florence Lui reports from around Mount Merapi.
When the weekend arrives, so do the tourists, hundreds of them by the busload. Then they pile into off-road trucks and head off, bumping along dusty trails for a close encounter with Indonesia's most active volcano. The alert level for Mount Merapi is now low. It's 9 years since the last major eruption. Tourists are allowed to go into the danger zone, as close as 4 kilometers from the crater. Agus Sudarmanto used to be a cattle farmer, but turned to off-road driving after his neighbor persuaded him to give it a go.
Pertama takutnya kenapa?
Whenever there's been an eruption, tourists are a bit wary and stay away, but they come back when the government says it's safe. The volcano is dangerous, of course, but there are also benefits.
He sold some of his cows to buy his first utility vehicle. Now he has 3.
This tour has become so popular that there are now about 900 jeeps that cater to visitors. The highlight is this, driving through a river of rocks and sand, where lava from the 2010 eruption flowed.
It's not just nature and the spectacular views that attract the tourists. This museum of sorts is a testament to the power of Merapi. A collection of household items destroyed in the eruption in 2010 that killed 275 people. Endang is on her second visit to Merapi.
I was very happy and excited my first time here. But this trip I feel a bit sad thinking about the people who died. But it's a good tour. It educates people, especially for people who live in disaster-prone areas. They know how devastating such occurrences can be.
Asi knows just how deadly Merapi can be. He's the volcano's spiritual guardian, a traditional role going back generations. He succeeded his father, who was killed in the eruption 9 years ago. People still come to pay their respects to him.
Farmers take grass from Merapi. We take rocks and sand to build houses. We need to love Merapi. It's terrifying when it explodes, but when it calms down, we need to come back and take care of it.
The people of Merapi know they live in the shadow of danger, but have learned to adapt and even benefit from it. Florence Lui, Al Jazeera, Mount Merapi, Indonesia.
The French inventor known as the Flying Man has failed in his attempt to cross the English Channel on his jet-powered flyboard. Frankie Zapata was rescued after plunging into the sea during a refueling stop. He was only allowed to refuel once on a boat. Zapata planned to land on the British coast near Dover after a flight time of about 20 minutes. The former jet skiing champion says he's not giving up despite a disappointing day.
I had a tough break and I'm disappointed, that's for sure. But I believe that Louis Blériot probably wasn't able to fly his plane when he tried it for the first time. The history of aviation is made of people who failed, and it's only when you get back on your feet that you can make any progress. And I said it before, this challenge was extremely complex.
Well, still ahead on Al Jazeera. In sport, the Italian footballer hoping this miss isn't an omen for the season ahead. And now it's time for sport. And yeah, here there's a push for gender equality in the Tour de France.
There is. It's not happening just yet, but could be a few years down the road. In the meantime, Colombian Nairo Quintana has just won stage 18 of the Tour, powering away in the high Alps to win by 1.5 minutes, moving him up to the top 10 overall. Fellow Colombian Egan Bernal was also on the move. The Team Ineos rider is up to second behind leader Julian Alaphilippe. Defending champion Geraint Thomas, while he's dropped down to third. More bad news for Thomas after support rider Luke Rowe was kicked out of the Tour. This following an altercation with Tony Martin during Wednesday's stage. The pair say they've been harshly treated. Now, as we mentioned, a group of female amateurs are riding every stage of the Tour just ahead of the male professionals. They're trying to push for a women's version of cycling's biggest race, but Tour de France organisers said isn't possible now because of logistics. Natasha Butler has more from the French Alps.
The spectacular peaks of the French Alps, still dotted with patches of snow despite the summer heat. The Izoard mountain pass is more than 2,300 metres high. For these riders, it's a tantalising test of strength and part of a campaign for a women's Tour de France. The world's most famous bike race is exclusively for men.
We want a women's race equal to the men's because the Tour de France is monument, it's the race. So the best way to encourage young women to cycle is with media coverage of a big women's race.
5 years ago, this group of women set out to raise awareness about the inequalities in professional cycling. Each July, they ride all 21 stages of the Tour. It's a challenging route of nearly 3,500 kilometres, but they do so in conditions far less comfortable than the men's, with traffic, a modest support team, no prize money or fanfare. This year, these international riders have joined them.
We're everyday girls, we've got full-time jobs, and if we can do it, anybody can do it.
We've got a lot of fatigue in the legs. There's a lot of emotions all over the place as well, because it's quite draining mentally as well as physically, because we don't have the support that the professionals have.
In the 1980s, the organisers of the Tour de France experimented with a women's race, but they said that it failed to attract enough public and media attention. But times have changed. Women's sport is popular, and now the organisers are saying that they are considering an equivalent women's race. The ASO company that runs the Tour has yet to provide details of a future race, but it's expected to be longer than their one-day women's event. These Tour enthusiasts say it would be a welcome addition to the cycling calendar.
A women's World Cup team had lots of coverage, so why not a women's Tour de France?
At the end of the 18th stage, the Galibier Pass is a grueling climb, but the prospect of a women's tour makes the effort worthwhile.
I'm euphoric at the idea that the organizers of the tour think it is possible to create a big stage race in France for women riders. They really deserve it.
Reaching the top is overwhelming for some, but the sense of achievement is clear. And with only days until the end of the 3-week challenge, these women are riding high. Natasha Butler, the Galibier Pass, the Alps, France.
Manchester United have picked up their 4th straight pre-season win. United beating Champions League finalists Tottenham 2-1 here in Shanghai. Anthony Martial scoring the opener. Some bad news for United. Eric Bailly carried off with what appeared to be a serious knee injury. A deflected Lucas Moura shot resulted in an equaliser for Spurs before teenager Angel Gomez grabbed the winner for United. Fiorentina's Marco Benassi will be hoping an incident from a friendly against Benfica isn't an omen for his season ahead. Benassi missing an open goal in the game against the Portuguese champions. This was played in New Jersey in the States. Turned out to be a costly miss. Benfica going on to win 2-1. England are building up a second innings lead as they aim to recover from the embarrassment of the first day of their test match with Ireland. They were bowled out for 85 at Lord's on Wednesday. It's looking marginally better for the world champions at the moment. Jack Leach scored 92 and Jason Roy made the fastest half-century by an England player on debut. And one of Sri Lanka's all-time great players is getting ready to play in his last one-day international. Fast bowler Lasith Malinga will retire from ODIs after Friday's match against Bangladesh. The 35-year-old has taken more than 300 wickets in this form of the game. NBA star Kawhi Leonard says he wants to make history at his new team, the LA Clippers. The two-time Finals MVP was officially introduced by the Clippers along with Paul George to the press in LA here. Leonard, who helped the Toronto Raptors win their first ever NBA championship in June, went to the Clippers and then helped the LA side recruit his former Indiana teammate George. And the son of one of the greatest heavyweights in boxing history is following in his footsteps. This is 21-year-old Evan Holyfield, son of Evander, who fights at junior middleweight. He's turning pro after 10 years and 80 bouts as an amateur. Evander was a two-time undisputed heavyweight champion. He has some serious steps to follow him. OK, there'll be more sport from me throughout the day, but that is it for me.
Thanks, Andy. Well, that's it from me, Nastasia Tay, for this NewsHour, but I'll be back in just a moment with another roundup of the day's news.